Depending on who you ask, Juno is either a NASA space probe studying Jupiter, or she's the Roman queen of the gods, wife of Jupiter, god of thunder. Now, as the Roman counterpart of Hera, the wife of Zeus in Greek mythology, she's often characterised as a jealous, bitter and vindictive wife, often punishing the nymphs or goddesses with whom Jupiter had various dalliances. Yet Juno doesn't get much credit for her incredible loyalty, even if Jupiter can't manage the same in return. But she does have some additional qualities that come with her absorption by the Roman state, and these make Juno a much more interesting figure within Roman religion and explain why she was so popular in ancient Rome. So let's go and meet Juno and find out exactly how she did fit into everyday life in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host, Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I hope that you're well. I'm currently sitting watching a really horrible rainstorm while I'm recording this, but I don't think that the microphone is sensitive enough to pick that up, which is a shame, because that would be quite nice background noise, I think. We are continuing with the Roman Gods series today, and we're going to continue with one who does actually have some sort of impact on everyday life, or at least matters that occur in everyday life might be a better way of putting it. So last week we had a look at Sylvanus, who really was very much a part of everyday life and really popular despite being an unofficial god, whereas this week we're having a look at a goddess who was pretty much one of the most popular ones in Rome and very much an official goddess, and that is Juno. So who was Juno? So Juno was one of the three most important deities in Rome, and the other two were her husband Jupiter and Jupiter's daughter Minerva, and together they're sometimes referred to as the Capitoline Triad. Now Juno's parents were Saturn and Ops, while her siblings were Jupiter, Neptune, Vesta, Pluto and Ceres. And obviously there is also an episode on Jupiter, and then there's another one on Neptune as well. Juno also gave her name to the month of June. Incidentally, where the genius was the deity that accompanied each man throughout his life, the Juno was the female equivalent, and this starts to give us a little bit of a hint into what it is that Juno was actually the goddess of, which we'll come to in a moment. While she is often equated with Hera, Juno isn't just an imitation of a goddess from another culture. As we shall see, she does seem to have quite long roots in Italy itself. And Writer Valerius Maximus portrayed Juno as being stern, quick to anger, and concerned with morality and chastity, but he also stressed her ability to intervene in worldly affairs, and it's this that sees her take quite a keen interest in affairs of the Roman state, something that we don't necessarily see in the same way with Hera and the Greek state. So like I mentioned before about Juno being also the name of the spirit that would accompany women throughout their lives, Juno basically protected women and had jurisdiction over most things to do with women's lives. Her huge range of epithets let us see her working in specific ways, and this is essentially what epithets do. So as an example, Juno Augalis is the goddess of marriage, while Juno Lucina was a childbirth goddess. So in both cases, it's still Juno, but each of these is a different aspect. So rather than just calling on Juno and asking for help with something, you would then call on the specific part of Juno that related to the thing that you want help with, if that makes sense. We also had Juno Regina, which was her state aspect linked to the military, and as Juno Sospita, she protected warriors. Now that version of Juno often appears related to affairs of state, which does obviously underline her protective nature, and consuls actually went to her temple at Lanuvium every year to worship Juno Sospita. And Juno Sospita does seem to have existed independently of Rome, being later incorporated into the pantheon after the Romans seized Lanuvium, so it's difficult to tell kind of where Juno Sospita originally came from, if she was actually a Roman goddess that the people at Lanuvium adopted, or if she actually came from Lanuvium and then was adopted backwards. It's a bit of a complicated story, and it's kind of beyond the scope of this podcast to really look at all the historical and archaeological evidence. This is just more concerned with the idea of Juno and how she appeared in people's lives. Now, one of the things that's quite interesting about Juno Sospita is the fact that a whole list of omens and portents acted as indications of divine wrath, and the ones linked with her often happened at times when the Roman state was in peril. So this is how she's then seen as being protective of the Roman state, because she's letting her feelings be known through these portents so that the Romans can essentially hopefully do something about them. There is also the aspect Juno Moneta, and that was another warlike aspect, and her name translated to Juno the Warner, sometimes Juno who warns. And here her prophetic abilities actually help to protect the state. Now, there are some people online who I have seen breathlessly declare Juno Moneta as a goddess of money. It's basically because of the fact that the mint where they made coins was near her temple, and I do think calling her a goddess of money is oversimplifying the issue quite a lot, really. There was another version of Juno that was linked to the new moon, which is Juno Cavella, and this could explain why the calends, or the day of the new moon, was considered sacred to Juno. And the one thing that is really bizarre about the Roman calendar is the fact that we would think of like the first day of the month as being like, where that month begins, so like the 1st of June. But they took it instead from the day of the new moon, and then the day of the full moon was sacred to Jupiter. So the calendar worked a little bit differently to us. But it's interesting that the first day of the month would be considered the day of the new moon, and that was related to Juno. And there are some scholars who talk about the way that she was seen as almost birthing the new moon. So because she was so associated with childbirth, it would make sense that the new moon would then be associated with her. Now, the calends of March was especially important because husbands gave their wives presents to celebrate the matronalia on that day. So the matronalia often becomes considered as a Juno festival as well. Now, there are a ton of other epithets as well, and it would be quite dull if I just listed them all. But those are the ones that most people sort of talk about, and I think give quite an interesting overview of the kind of things that she looked after. So you've got a looking after things like fertility and marriage, but then you've also got a looking after the Roman state as well. So she's a very protective goddess, often associated with sovereignty. So where did Juno actually come from? Again, there are lots of scholars talking about this. There are lots of different viewpoints. I'm not looking at this necessarily from the same perspective, so this is more of an overview. But some scholars think that Juno's cult originally came from central Italy, long before the Romans looked to Hera for inspiration, and it is possible that she was originally part of the Sabine pantheon. And the earliest altars to Juno were actually dedicated by Titus Tatius, who was a Sabine king. Others think that Juno was originally the Etruscan goddess Uni, meaning that she actually came from northern Italy, and in both cases that meant that the cult would then have either spread south or north to Rome, depending on which one you're looking at. And more people seem to think that the idea that Juno came from the Sabine culture is considered more likely. Now, Juno Sospita does complicate matters as well, because no one is entirely sure how old her cult is. You've got people on one side saying, they'd already imported Hera and then kind of changed what she was the goddess of almost. Other people say that she seems to predate the Romans, and either way that would make her quite an ancient character. So it's really difficult to know. And then to make it even more complicated, in one ancient legend, a local Latin goddess named Fortuna nurses twin babies, Jupiter and Juno. Now, by the 19th century, a new translation of an inscription had emerged that recast Fortuna as Jupiter's daughter rather than his mother. But Jupiter and Juno do remain the sovereign couple either way. So again, it's difficult to know precisely where Juno comes from. But I do think that we can see her as being quite independent of Hera in a lot of ways. Now, she's usually shown wearing a tunic or a cloak, while she nearly always wears a diadem or a crown to signify her role as Queen of the Gods. Peacocks were Juno's sacred birds, and in some images she's riding in a golden chariot pulled by peacocks. And indeed, if you find statues of Juno Regina, she usually holds a scepter and a libation bowl, kind of to indicate which version of the goddess you're looking at. The images of Juno Sospita are even more interesting. She wore a horned goatskin, pointed shoes, and she carried a shield and a spear. So in a lot of ways she actually looks a bit more like Minerva, but you can still tell that it's Juno because again she's still wearing her crown. The peacock at her side is sometimes replaced by a snake for Juno Sospita, and Rianne Herman suggests that the snake is actually Draco. Now, a serpent was linked with Juno Sospita through a rite associated with her temple at Lanuvium, which may explain the serpent on coins featuring that aspect of the goddess. That said, her Greek counterpart Hera is also linked with a serpent, and in some of the myths, the dragon Lardon guards her golden apples in the Garden of the Hesperides. And in one version of the myth, Hercules kills Ladon as one of his labours, and a distraught Juno places Ladon in the sky as the Draco constellation. And I should also point out as well that Juno's epithet of Sospita actually presents her as a saviour, so it's quite interesting that she would then be linked with the temple where consuls and so on went to sacrifice. Now, Juno was worshipped throughout central Italy as well as in Rome, and she does also appear elsewhere in the empire as Juno Dolicena, the consort of Jupiter Dolicenus, and if you want to know more about him, you can check out the Jupiter episode. Now, people would actually offer coins to Juno Lucina before every birth, obviously for luck, and after a successful birth, families would then set up a whole table of gifts to Juno Lucina for a month, obviously to say thank you. So this is where we can start to see Juno appearing in a much more everyday, kind of mundane way for people, rather than just simply being sort of the state-sponsored god. Like if you look at someone like Mars, there's quite a lot of festivals to him that revolve around the military calendar, because obviously there's only certain things that ordinary people are going to be able to do. So the military would obviously worship Mars, but like an ordinary person in the street probably wouldn't, whereas Juno has much more intercession in their daily affairs. Now, Juno Lucina also played a role in the Lupercalia, which is the famous mid-February fertility festival, and goat skins were used to whip women to make them fertile, and these goat skins were sacred to Juno. And again, that also kind of has links back to the goat skin worn by Juno Sospita as well. I should point out that not much is actually known about how people worship Juno Sospita, but it does seem that an annual sacrifice of some description was involved. Now, one of the fascinating things about Juno is actually the role that she plays regarding the rise of Rome, and I think this is the thing that's quite unique to Juno and basically absent from a lot of the myths about Hera. And weirdly, for a figure so intrinsically tied to the state, Juno actually often opposed the empire in a lot of the earlier myths. And according to the Aeneid by Virgil, Juno was actually the patron goddess of the city of Carthage. She hated Aeneas, who was the hero from Troy. Now, throughout the Aeneid, Juno hounds Aeneas, but eventually she does realise that he has to triumph because he is the ancestor of the Romans. In another myth about the early days of Rome, Juno actually intercedes on behalf of the Sabines, who invaded Rome. Now, the reason that they'd done that is because Romulus, Rome's first king, had told his subjects to kidnap Sabine women to provide wives, and obviously thus to then help to start the Roman state. And then the Sabine husbands and fathers had then come and attacked Rome in response to try and get the women back. And it's Juno that opens the Janus Gate to let them into Rome. Now, given her apparent importance to the Sabines, it's hardly surprising that Juno would weigh in on their side. There is a little bit of, obviously, shenanigans with this part, because Juno is essentially stepping on Janus's toes by opening his gate, and he sort of ends up having to get involved in an indirect way, because he doesn't want to take Juno on, because she is quite famous for her temper. So he does end up having to weigh in via some river nymphs, but it is quite interesting, as I say, that Juno essentially goes against Rome in this early myth. But it wasn't all bad, because the Romans shut themselves in the city after the Gauls defeated them in around 387 before Common Era, and when the Gauls tried to scale the walls at night, the geese in Juno's precinct made so much noise that the Roman soldiers woke up, discovered what was going on, and fought off the Gauls. And this myth was important in showing Juno's protection of Rome rather than her always standing against it, and it also helps to feed into that idea of Juno Moneta and the idea of her warning people as to what was going on in order to protect the state. Now, other myths are much more familiar from the Greek stories that they borrow from. And in one example, Juno was jealous that Jupiter had given birth to Minerva from his forehead, because obviously she's then essentially this motherless goddess. And Juno decided that she wanted to have a child without Jupiter's intercession. So Juno visited Flora, the goddess of flowers, who touched her with a special flower. Some people say it was a foxglove, and Juno then conceived Mars as a result, and she was so delighted with Mars that she actually showered Flora with honours to show her gratitude. And I think that's something that we don't really see enough of in some of these myths, the fact that Juno is fiercely loyal to Jupiter. And if he didn't keep having a wandering eye, shall we say, she wouldn't need to be punishing nymphs left, right and centre. And it is the fact that if someone then does something to help her, she does show her gratitude towards them. So I think that she kind of deserves a little bit more credit for that. And obviously in another myth, again about Jupiter and nymphs, Juno is convinced that Jupiter is having an affair with Io, one of the nymphs. So Juno turns Io into a heifer, assuming that that's going to put Jupiter off, but obviously Jupiter being Jupiter, it doesn't, and she then places Argus, her loyal servant, on guard. Now, Argus has 100 eyes in some versions of the myth, so whenever some of them are asleep, the others are awake, so he's the ideal watchman. Now, Jupiter obviously isn't going to be put off by this, so he sends his son Mercury to see Argus, and Mercury lulls him to sleep. Once all 100 eyes are closed, Mercury cuts off Argus's head, and then therefore Jupiter can finally get to Io. Now, Juno is upset at the death of her servant, and she mounts his eyes in a peacock's tail to honour him. And this particular myth is one of the ones used to explain why you have that beautiful eye-like design in the tail of a peacock. So ultimately, what do we make of Juno? Well, you might be able to tell from the episode that I actually quite like Juno. I've got quite a soft spot for her. But she is a complex figure. There's a lot more to her than I can really do justice to in this episode. I just really wanted to try and provide an insight into how ordinary people might have seen Juno and how the state might have seen Juno, but also the fact that, there's a bit more to her than just being this jealous wife that she's usually painted as. Now, her protection over women is obviously one aspect to her, and I think that's how she probably appeared in a more day-to-day kind of aspect. But elsewhere, she does obviously enjoy that triple aspect that we see, which is fertility, sovereignty, and war, which I think in a lot of ways is a really interesting combination. And I think that this makes her a lot more interesting than being just the wife of Jupiter. And it does also give her a lot more importance than perhaps other goddesses to the state. So Minerva is useful because she's like the goddess of military strategy essentially, but Juno's helpful for the empire both at home and abroad. Now, scholars might argue about whether Juno is simply the Roman version of Hera, or whether Juno is the product of cultural exchanges between pre-Roman people and the Greeks. Now, that is obviously beyond the scope of this particular episode, which is concerned with folklore, and that's where I am more interested in how ordinary people may have actually dealt with her. So I think as far as ordinary people went, they obviously had an interest in this particularly fascinating and multifaceted goddess. And I think we can probably see soldiers praying to her because obviously she protected them. We can see mothers praying to her. We can see married women praying to her. And also she does appear in some ways to kind of guard chastity and so on. So I dare say virgins probably found her quite a useful goddess to pray to if they felt they needed to be protected. But from offerings to give thanks for a safe birth to celebrating the new moon every month, I do think that a lot of people had reasons to celebrate Juno, and I think that we probably should as well. So you'll have to let me know what you think of Juno. I did think it was quite funny that the space probe that they sent to basically go and survey Jupiter was called Juno, considering how she's always kind of spying on Jupiter in the myths. So I did quite appreciate that from NASA. There is also an asteroid called Juno as well, just to be extra confusing. Next week, we're going to have a look at perhaps one of my favourite gods, Vulcan. Now, I have, as I say, briefly touched on him before in the Blacksmiths episode, but we're going to look into him a lot more because he was also incredibly useful, but in a completely different way. So we will have a look at Vulcan and some of his myths and also his festival, the Vulcanalia, because that is coming up in August. And the last week is going to possibly be Minerva, but somebody else also suggested Pomona. I do need to look more into Pomona to see if there's enough to justify an entire episode about her, but if there isn't, we might actually have a look at her instead. But as I say, we shall see. I do also want to point out that if you are free at 6 p.m. British Standard Time on the 7th of August, I'm doing an online talk, so that means that you don't have to go anywhere. You can watch from the comfort of your own home, in conjunction with Cresswell Craigs, all about harvest folklore and harvest superstitions and so on. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, obviously with a British focus, just because that's where I'm based, but if you're interested in kind of what people did to make sure that they had a good harvest, both before and after they actually brought the harvest in, and things like that, then please feel free to come along. Obviously, there is an Eventbrite link just kind of for checking numbers and so on, and you'll get sent the Zoom link and whatnot. So it is free, although obviously donations do go to Cresswell Craigs to help them with the site because they are a charity. So if you are available at 6 p.m. British Standard Time on the 7th of August, then obviously you'll be more than welcome to come and join me at the talk. But other than that, I hope you have a marvellous week ahead, and I'll see you next week when we go and have a chat with Vulcan. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee. or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.